Can you make him welcome, please?
Very much standing on other people's shoulders, especially Peter Helson, who it was my privilege to meet today. Please give Peter Helson a burst of applause just for me, will you? Because his work was absolutely wonderful. Well, there's his full name. He preferred to be called Jim. His father was a station master. He left school at age 14, took the railway exam and went into the railway. Was utterly brilliant, and by age 21 he is a station master, which was... You've got to remember that in these days railways were the acme of high tech. You know, this was really where everything was at. Well, when the war came, like many people, he endeavoured to enlist immediately. But he had a few missing teeth, and also he was in a reserved occupation, so he had extreme difficulty enlisting in the very beginning of the war. He'd invested in a couple of land blocks for his future, so he sold those and went to England missed that. As a station master, he had lots of time on his spare hands. He was a very good conjurer, apparently, and he's also a whiz at Morse code, which was very useful to him later on. But when he went to England, he joined the Royal Naval Air Service, which at the time was still using Bristol box kites as their basic trainer. He trained at Chingford at an early stage of development, and the pilots were billeted in farmhouses around Chingford, which was an outer suburb of London. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, the lorry would drive around, pick them all up and bring them in for training, because the Bristol box kites didn't like flying in the wind very much, so they flew when it was nice and quiet. This picture is Chingford a year later, in October 1915, but a quick word about the Royal Naval Air Service. Here, by 1915, they were pretty well organised. The Royal Naval Air Service was formed in 1912. It was about 2/3 of the size of the RFC at the outbreak of war. Churchill was a strong supporter of the idea. And the Royal Naval Air Service, in theory, looked after home defence and naval matters. But just to indicate that they were pretty organised, this is mid-1915. Goble's first appointment was to the Dover Patrol. Again, this is a map that is a year later than December 1915. But the Dover Patrol looked after the defences of the English Channel, and they had mines, and they had patrol boats, and they had aircraft. Now, this is something I found out in researching this talk. The Germans were really very close to England, 100 kilometres away, 100 kilometres from Dover to Ostend. So it's sort of like if the enemy's at Lithgow. I never realised that before. But anyway, after a couple of months flying on patrols in the Dover Patrol, he moved on. Now, throughout this story, I am skipping out event after event of failure of engines, forced landings, collapsing of parts of aircraft. I'm just giving you the basic idea of his story, but every day was an adventure at this time. Not much enemy aircraft, luckily, but flying was a very dangerous sort of thing. In December 1915, he moved on to St Pol, which is near Amiens, and he had not a lot of experience with modern aircraft until he flew there. One of his exploits was flying a Caudron. Apparently he saw his first Caudron the night before, never had any training to fly it, and flew it off the next day in a mission with an inexperienced gunner in the back. But anyway, Okay, so on 9th of January he had his first combat. Basically they were involved in bombing of Ostend, and throughout his career Goble was the sort of guy who always volunteered for the extra works. You know, you could imagine him making up the lunch rosters and things like that. I'm joking a bit there, but seriously, if things needed to be organised, he would do it. And also, he was recognised as an expert in Morse code and did a lot of training in that area too. July the 16th, first aerial victory, flying in Newport. And imagine flying an open cockpit fighter to 16,000 feet. And even in the first stop with Pup to 19,000 feet. I mean, I went to, I think, 12,000 feet on the top of Mount Blanc, and I was just about out of it. It's unbelievable. Anyway, when they got their first stop with Pup in his squadron, he was given to the job of flying it, and obviously is very good at it. He scored the first victory to be scored in a stop with Pup on the 24th of September. And by this time he had the DSC and the French Croix de Guerre for various deeds. I really don't go into it a lot because there's a lot of sameness about it, one exciting thing after another. A picture of the very first Sopwith, not a very good one, but so he was promoted in October 1916 to commanding B flight of one wing Royal Naval Air Service, and so he gained experience as a fighter pilot. The next step was in 8th Squadron for service on the Somme River, sort of further south, towards the end of the bit of battle of the trenches there, and he made offensive patrols over the German lines with Sopwith's Pup. Robert Little, the Australian fighter ace with the highest score, was in his flight actually at this time. Oh, sorry, wrong thing. Okay. In December 1916 he got the Distinguished Service Order, and I think I'm right in saying that's one step down from the Victoria Cross, isn't it? So quite amazing. But he got it not for shooting down enemy, but for different things, particularly bomber escort. He had a tremendous reputation as a bomber escort, making sure that the bombers got home and beating off the enemy. Now, Peter Helson's articles are redolent with words of praise from the senior officer for Goble, one after the other, and here is one of them. Oh, down. Right, okay. Moving on, in February 1917, a squadron of Sopwith triplanes. The procurement for the Royal Flying Corps and for the Royal Naval Air Service was quite different, and it was the Royal Naval Air Service who introduced the Sopwith triplane. Very manoeuvrable, very good in dogfights, and based on Dunkirk, he made a reputation for attacking balloons, observing as a single pilot, from what I can gather. I picked that up from somewhere else, Peter, but apparently he had an appreciation of ability to scan the ground beneath him and report back to the army. Escorting, reconnaissance, spotting aircraft, and high altitude flying. Again, these were the things that he tended to be noted for. April 1917, back to Dover. And what sort of an aeroplane is that? Indeed, it's a Gotha bomber. And at this time, the Germans were actually making quite a show of bombing Britain with these rather large aircraft. Britain was a bit behind in bomber aircraft, and they were just starting to develop things like the Vickers Vimy, the Handley Page and the Blackburn. And the Goters had quite a time where they were almost untouchable. Now, Britain then started emphasising bombers, and Goble was given the task of leading a squadron of DH-4 bombers. This is a picture of a model, and it's supposed to be in Royal Naval Air Service livery. Goble, in taking over his squadron, brought in some innovations. First of all, he doubled the Lewis guns in the back, so you had 2 Lewis guns. Now, the DH-4 is sort of like the Mosquito in World War II, as fast as most fighters. So, really, if you kept your DH-4s in a tight squadron, in a tight formation, the fighters weren't fast enough to attack from beneath, so they had to attack from above and behind virtually, and that meant that they ran into a tremendous barrage of counter-fire. Richthofen, who was fighting in the other side of the lines at this time, had 80 or 81, the numbers vary, victories, and only one was a DH-4. Anyway, he adopted several other measures. The idea of flying in a formation so that the bombs were all aimed from the lead aircraft, and when he dropped his bomb, everybody else dropped their bomb, so all the bombs landed in a carpet, and the accuracy of the bombing was much improved. The Brits used it during the period between the wars to deal with the troublesome tribesmen. And on the ground, he instituted at his air bases better shelter for the against the night bombing, and overall, he concentrated, as far as I can see, Peter, on ensuring the safety and efficiency of his flight, both of his squadron. Oh, darn! Excuse me. Right. You're going to see a lot of this frightful map of mine. The first, I'll see if I can make this pointer work. Yeah, the first place that his squadron was stationed was at Petty Snythe, which is a suburb of Dunkirk, more or less, and they had a range of about 100 kilometres, so they could attack beyond Ghent. This was more or less strategic bombing, rather than aerial cooperation. I'll come back to that in a moment. Attacking railway junctions and airfields and things like that. Now, the activity in the north wasn't as great as the activity down here. So on the 3rd of March they moved south. Peter Helson has written about 60 pages, and I think I found an error. But they set up their forward base to the west of Champion, and as I said, largely it was strategic type bombing behind the lines. On this particular day, 16th March 1918, they tried something else. The bomber squadron attacked the town of the German air base at Bussigny, and the idea was that there would be squadrons of British fighters lurking high, and they would dive down on the German fighters when they attacked the DH-4s. But the fighters got lost and didn't turn up, so the DH-4s were sort of trailing their coats over the enemy airfield, and suddenly they were set upon by masses of enemy fighters. And the pilot in Goble's flight, Goble by this time was usually flying in the back seat looking after the guns, said later on that he was terribly glad he had Goble in the back seat because he shot down 2 aircraft. They were actually Goble's final 2 victories. His total of victories was only 10. Only 10. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, think of the strategic situation in the war at this time. The Russians have been defeated. The Americans are on the way. So this is the time that the Germans put every effort they had into to winning on the Eastern Front before the Russians came. Look, my apologies to the experts in this. This is my simple version, okay? So the Brits and French at last, as far as I can see, got the idea that it wasn't a good idea to have hundreds of people charging across into machine guns with their bayonets. They were better off in this case yielding ground and killing the Germans as they charged into the machine guns. So the Germans here advanced up to about 100 kilometres in that final offensive. And now, can you see the area here with the circle in it? This is a bit closer a view of it. Now, the British knew that the attack was coming, so they designed an idea of this withdrawal. And Goble was the absolute expert in doing it. First of all, the base is slightly to the east of Champion, and the Germans were attacking. So the first thing that Goble did was send half his ground crew to establish a base behind the first one. So they flew from the first base as long as they could, and when the base was about to be overrun, they landed in the second base. The ground crew from the first base immediately hopped in their vehicles and horses and carts and whatever and moved to establish a base behind that. And the same sort of leapfrog action occurred. Goble's squadron moved 4 times before they set up a base just south of Amiens. And something I was thinking of here, if I can find it, see the X? That's Villers-Bretonneux, the little village that has the reputation of, has the story that the Australians saved it during the war. We will never forget Australia. I wonder if the squadron led by the Australians took a part in the defending of Villers-Bretonneux. The whole idea of this was that they switched from strategic bombing to army support. So we were talking about this just a while ago. What's the exact word? Yeah, army cooperation. And so you had the leapfrog action here. Here's Villers-Bretonneux, just short of the German advance. And I wonder whether the Australian squadron helped defend Villers-Bretonneux, or the Australian-led squadron helped defend Villers-Bretonneux. The heavies lined up to heap praise on Goble for this action. The local commander, the brigadier, led the way. Major General Salmond also congratulated him on his splendid work. The headquarters at Dunkirk, the Dover Patrol, and they all were extremely praiseworthy. They lined up to heap praise on Goble. I wonder whether he used his railway timetabling knowledge. I wouldn't mind betting that the skill in logistics came from that sort of thing. During this time the RAAF was formed, and Goble sort of took an interest in overall tactics, strategy, logistics, this type of thing. And the line that he put out was that it wasn't a matter of how many bombs you dropped, but where they hit. He said that a lot of the squadron commanders were judged on how many casualties they had, because that indicated how tough they were. He said it's better to have an efficient squadron that really hits the ground than to wipe off people just for the sake of saying, geez, I'm tough. As I said, I have skipped over time and again events where Goble did amazing things. I'll just mention one early in the piece. His engine failed in a combat. He glided 5 miles and just got over the lines into Allied territory, borrowed some tools, fixed his aeroplane and flew back home. I mean, there are stories like this in Peter's narrative, one after the other. But this is the last one. On this particular raid in June 1918, the aircraft had a near miss from anti-aircraft fire. The pilot was unconscious. Goble in the back seat had a joystick and a throttle. He kept the aircraft under control, and he brought the aircraft under control from a disastrous spin. He kept the aircraft under control until luckily the pilot recovered enough to help him land the aeroplane. And this was the last, well, I'll call it an adventure, but you know what I mean. Well, this was June 1918. There was a bout of enteric fever, typhoid, an epidemic of that. But Goble and his deputy squadron leader, I've forgotten his name and rank, said, oh, we're too busy to get vaccinated. And they caught typhoid fever. And he ended the war in hospital. Anyway, after the war, he was one of the leading Australian, well, he's the leading Australian airman administrator in England, and he got the job with his RNAS experience, etc., of being air advisor to the Australian Naval Board. He had a rank of lieutenant colonel. That puzzles me a bit. I'd love to talk to somebody who, the preceding speaker, and I'm sorry I've forgotten your name, about how he got this rank, but so he went from major to, anyway, he's air advisor to the Australian Naval Board. Now, as you all know, after the war, Britain gave Australia 100 aircraft which formed the basis of the RAAF. The gift was made in 1919, and it was about 1922 when this photo was taken to indicate the setting up of the Royal Australian aircraft with sample aircraft behind it. Now, Billy Hughes was in England. I don't know whether Goble got in his ear or not, but Hughes decided that they had to have some seaplanes in Australia. The thought being that you could fly a seaplane anywhere around the coast, whereas, an aeroplane had to have an airfield. So they bought 6 Fairey 3Ds. The first one was accepted by Mrs. Hughes and named Mary in her honour, and they were shipped to Australia, where they arrived in 1921, but they weren't unpacked because there was a depression at the end of the war and money was short. They unpacked the first one, and that was about it. I'm going to break the narrative at a moment now to set up the story of the next 10 years. I've talked about Goble coming from a middle-class background and rising up to quite a high rank. Now, the same thing applied with Williams, the founder of the father in inverted commas of the Air Force. His father was a miner. He worked in various ordinary sort of jobs before he went to the war, and was rather a similar sort of person in many ways to Goble, in that he's a good administrator, brave, lucky to survive, full of initiative and so on. He was supported by he was the advisor to the army, in effect. So the logical thing was that Williams would become the leader of the Australian Air Force and Goble would become the deputy. Now there's only one problem with this. They hated each other. They couldn't get along in the slightest. William was and I'm oversimplifying a lot here, please bear with me, was a sort of, ramrod up the back, stiff upper lip, cranky sort of sod. Goble had, he started as a very religious person, but he seemed to mellow during the war. And the Australian Dictionary of Biography never looks for controversy, but it makes the point that the two people hated each other so much that it was the policy of the government and the Air Force to try and keep one in England and one in Australia. So, Williams was sent to England to do some high-level training. Goble was in charge, and he talked the government into letting them fly an aeroplane around Australia. So A103, here, by the way, this is interesting just for the trivia buffs. This is an early picture of this aeroplane, and it's labelled ANA3 for Navy, right? And then it was relabelled when the Air Force was formed. The series was relabelled and it became A103. So they chose A103 to fly around Australia. Quick word about the Ferry 3, not a little aircraft, weighed about 2.5 times the weight of a tiger moth, had very similar performance. There's the details. In my presentations I always put too many details in because people then can replay them and read the details if they want to. But basically, 3-man crew, a couple of machine guns, the standard sort of thing, very similar speed and performance to a tiger moth. The Fairy had a longer range, and that's about it. But, imagine flying through a tropical storm in a tiger moth. No, thank you. The logistics of flying around Australia were quite enormous. You had, 37 dumps, I think, of fuel and oil and distilled water all around the nation. And if I can get this pointer working, from about here to about Darwin, there'd hardly been any aircraft. Well, there'd been no aircraft. So the dumps had to be taken into the most difficult places to get out, especially, for example, Elcho Island here. So they had to be carried in a coastal steamer, and it appears that there was an Air Force person appointed to guard each fuel dump, even the ones that weren't used. I'll come back to that in a moment. In the event, this is the path that that Goble and Macintyre, who I'll talk about in a moment, his other crewman, flew, and you can see all the stopping spaces. The A103 was done up as well as possible. They removed the second cockpit, put in a fuel tank, so they only had a 2-man crew. Threw away the radio, there wasn't any chance of listening to it. Put an additional radiator in the vehicle, because British aeroplanes, when they came to Australia, usually overheated. So, especially in the tropics, you needed an extra radiator. An alcohol-fueled compass in the front cockpit, not fueled, filled. The compass floated in a bath of alcohol. And I'll tell the story of the compass now. in the first hour or two into the flight it exploded because of combination of temperature and altitude. I don't understand, but anyway, the poor old pilot got drenched with alcohol and broken glass. They tried to repair it in Sydney, they replaced it in Brisbane, and in the end they gave up, and Goble, sitting in the back of the aeroplane, had 2 strings tied to the shoulders of the pilot, and so he had a compass functioning in the back cockpit, and he would pull the string to get Macintyre to steer the plane to the right course, and then he'd straighten him up. The petrol replaced the second crewman. The floats were they coated them with the stuff called biturene, which is a thick bitumen, put extra layer of fabric on them, and did everything they could because they knew it was the weakness of the aeroplane, and they tarted the aeroplane up, and it looked pretty good, as you can see from this picture, this drawing. But 45 minutes into the flight, they had their first forced landing in Corner Inlet, 45 minutes out from Point Cook, and they had to adjust the fuel and fly on. So, yeah, you've got to remember that in these days, the engines really only lasted 100 hours, and you had to work on the valves every time you flew them, and they weren't very reliable at all. I am not going to tell a step-by-step story of the flight. I'm just going to touch on different things. Here's the first landing. This is probably a picture of the aircraft landing at Rose Bay. Sorry it's of such a poor quality. I'll talk about the first leg. They wanted to fly to Brisbane in the first leg, but just off Newcastle they ran into a tremendous storm. And you've got to realise you're flying at 90 miles an hour and you've got 30 or 40 mile an hour winds pelting at you. It's not funny. So luckily they found a spot to land at the north of Port Stephens on the Mile River, and they landed here somewhere, damaged the floats in the process, and by themselves they had to repair the float and spend an extra day on the Mile River before they flew on to Brisbane. The physical demands on them were tremendous. Apart from flying through rain and things like that, they often had to watch the aeroplane in the night because it was moored in a tidal area, so likely to run aground. At least they had to supervise the watches. Sunburn was a huge problem. Macintyre had an infected finger, which gave huge problems. At Cooktown, Macintyre had he was so exhausted he just could not help with the aeroplane. So Goble looked after the aeroplane while Macintyre recovered. This picture was taken in Darwin. Macintyre is now carrying Goble because his feet were in a bad way. I'm not going on about that, but I'm not telling the story of what happened at each spot. But they were under tremendous physical strain, and it was an incredible feat to do it. Thursday Island, I will mention, nice little town at the time, and the point about it is, here they had a huge depot of supplies. They had an engine and some floats and things like that. And the plane very urgently needed floats. They'd had incident after incident with the floats. So a very capable aircraftman was there. His name was Corporal Gurr, and all I know about him was that he worked out how to lift the 1-ton aircraft up so they could put the floats on it. And this is called the shear legs. And the Parnell, whose narrative of the flight I've used very, very widely, describes how he manufactured this device called the shear legs, where you could actually lift the aircraft with just a whole series of pulleys, as you can see there. So they lifted the aircraft and put on some floats. Now, This was without a doubt the most dangerous part of the trip, because everywhere else they could fly alongside the coast, so they had a chance of landing on the water or even crashing on the land. But here the only way of getting from Thursday Island to Elcho Island was straight across the Gulf of Carpentaria, 772 kilometres, just about the maximum range of the aircraft. So they were relying on preferably winds blowing their way, but certainly no adverse winds, and the prevailing wind is adverse. So they waited for 4 or 5 days until they thought that the wind was okay. Now, this next bit, I don't want to be critical because this was 50 years ago. Now, they obviously lightened the aircraft as much as they possibly could. They didn't even take a spare lot of clothes, but they took 2 303 rifles and 500 rounds of ammunition. Do you know why? Because they were worried about the Aboriginal people. I kid you not. And as I said, this was the time. Okay, so they flew to Elcho Island and the engine started coughing about 50 miles out, and they were worried that it might conk out. And as I said, the Eagle engines weren't very reliable. Okay, now the attitude towards the Aboriginals was of its time. This is Fish and McGuinness's trip across the north of Australia when they surveyed the route for the Smith brothers. Okay, they were told. Sydney Cotton's father, many of you know about Sydney Cotton, was the manager of a station in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and he warned them about travelling through this area because murdering Tommy, the blackfellow, was likely to get them. But they found that they wouldn't have got through that area unless the Aborigines pushed them out of places like this in their Model T Ford. So the success of that journey depended on this sort of help from the Aboriginal people, even though they took their own 303 with them. Anyway, Elcho Island, Frank Doak records this. They were working on the machine. The Aboriginal people came down. One bloke is supposed to have said, "Hey, the engine was running roughly." He said, "Mine tickets this engine got bad bellyache." That was how it was reported anyway. But anyway, the natives came down and watched the people working on the aeroplane. They had some petrol and distilled water left over. They poured the petrol on the sand, chucked a torch into it. It burnt. They gave them some water and didn't work with them. Oh, very, very flaming funny. Look, there's Peter. No, this is not your area. Sorry, Naval Parnell. There are inconsistencies in this story. This photo is supposed to be taken at Elcho Island. There is no mention in the 3 narratives that I've got of the person at Elcho Island. Who was the photographer? How did they guard the petrol against the natives if that was the problem? Anyway, moving on. This is modern Elcho Island. It's now got an Aboriginal name, Gallywinku. Sorry about the quality of the picture, but you can see it's a nicely laid out town. It's famous for being a home of Geoffrey Gurumul Yurupingu. It's the inspiration for my island home. It has a tremendous dance troupe in the Museum of Mona in Brisbane. They have a gallery of their artworks. The school is trying some wonderful things in intercultural education. Now, the situation is not great, but there are so many positives in this place, and we've come so far in the last 50 years in our relationships with the Aboriginal people, and I recognise, in all seriousness, I recognise any people of Aboriginal descent who happen to be in the group and pay tribute to them. But anyway, on to Darwin. This was the second last of the really bad flight areas with next to no inhabitants below them. They pulled the aircraft out again to fix the floats, and Darwin itself only had about 2,200 people at the time, and communications were pretty bad, so the flight was out of communication with the rest of Australia for quite a while. The next step was on to The next step was on to Mission Bay, which is the most northerly settlement in Western Australia. It's modern Kalamburu. And this is a picture of the Mission Bay Mission, which was run by the Benedictine monks of New Norcia. Has anyone heard of that monastery in Western Australia? So this was their outpost. And here we see one of the monks teaching the Aborigines to make the sign of the cross. But the interesting thing is the monastery itself, because this is where the monks lived, because there was a fear that the Aborigines might attack them. And there's a description in a few years before of the monks hiding in the monastery while the Aboriginal was making threatening noises outside, and one of the monks had a revolver, and that was how they were going to defend themselves. Now, when Goble and Macintyre arrived in Mission Bay, they were met by the monks, who gave them a tremendous dinner with lots of their wine, which they were very good at making, and the Aborigines put on a corroboree, and they returned to camp by the aeroplane to watch it during the night. But they were caught by the tremendous tides that there are in this area. So they had to call out the Aboriginal people to keep their aeroplane safe, and they did a pretty good job, but guess what? They damaged the floats again. And so the Doak records that to thank the Aborigines, they poured some petrol on the water, chucked a match into it, and had a show of magic water burning. Okay, so let's move on. Oh dear, what have I done? Ah, yes, this is the modern mission, and two things to report. The mission is very well respected. The cooperation with the people is great. The how can I explain it? The interactions are mutually respectful. The people who are doing the flight around Australia that I'll talk about in a moment really enjoyed Kalamburu. The only problem was that the petrol for their planes when they used MoGas was $338 cents a litre. We're entering here the territory of Western Australian Airlines, and here we in the East do not appreciate this story, because in 1920 you had this wonderful airline starting up, one of the first in the world. So at Broome they were able to remove the third petrol tank and put in a third crewman. His name was aircraftman Goschalk, who was a brilliant mechanic. Just a quick shout out to Norman Brearley for his wonderful work in developing the airline, and the person behind him. Anyone? Kingsford Smith, exactly. So the run down the coast should have been fairly easy, but in Carnarvon, the engine wouldn't develop enough power to take off. Gottschalk worked on it for a couple of days, and in the end they decided they'd get a new engine up from Brisbane, which is 800 kilometres. 450 kilometres on a train, which was servicing the Mount Newman mines, and 350 kilometres over country in a truck. And no roads or anything. It took them some days to get there. It took them about 8 days to get the engine up from Perth, and Gottschalk fitted it overnight, and they flew on the next day. They flew on to Geraldton, and at Geraldton a huge crowd of people welcomed them, and kids climbed all over the aeroplane. They took off from Geraldton after they refuelled it, and about 30 minutes out they realised that fuel was leaking from the fuel tank. So they landed in the open sea and fixed up the wire, which the plug, and apparently the children had removed the wire on the plug. And so they screwed up the plug again, which ensured they had enough petrol to fly on, and took off. Gottschalk weighed 16 stone, and that meant that the aeroplane was fairly well loaded, and they took off through waves which broke over the bottom wing. I mean, a tremendous feat in getting such an underpowered aircraft off the ground. Now, as they went around Australia, the publicity grew. They started off, nobody knew about the flight. There was an article in the Brisbane paper. Then when they got to Broome, there were good communications there, and there were more articles. They got to Brisbane, and there was a whole page of photographs in the paper. And that was fairly rare at the time. Photographs took a lot of doing. Interesting picture of Mrs. Goble with the children here. When they were missing in the north of Australia, the version of the paparazzi knocked on her door and said, hey, are you worried about your husband? And she said, no, he'll be right. And so she had remarkable confidence in her husband, and she gained much kudos because of that. The reception in Perth was huge. They then had to fly across the Great Australian Bight. And I was talking to somebody here just a while ago who said that was a pretty horrendous sort of place, because you've got all these areas where you've got cliffs right down to the water. So if you land, you either have to land in the water and get bashed to bits on the cliff, or land on the land. But anyway, they got across the bay, the Gulf, quite easily. This was the first stop after Albany, Israelite Bay Telephone Station, population 4, and they were delighted to welcome the aviators. It's now in a national park, and there's just the ruins of the telegraph station there. I'm not going to talk about each stop. The story in Ceduna was incredible, but I haven't got time for that. Beautiful picture of the aircraft on the beach at Beachport. Belongs to Civil Aviation Historical Museum in Melbourne, actually. They provided me with that. But, you can just about feel the atmosphere in that. Oh, I can, anyway. I had hoped to be able to show you a film, but here's some homework for you. When you get home, Google in Goble flight on the Australian Film and AFTS Australian Film site, and there are 3 or 4 films about their arrival in Melbourne. I had hoped to be able to do it, but the reception isn't good enough here. A huge crowd met them at St Kilda. The Governor-General, the Governor, the state politicians met them they landed on the beach, met them on the pier, and then they were carried by this crowd of people to up the end of the pier, where they are met by the local civic dignitaries, and flew on to Point Cook. They were awarded the Britannia Trophy for the most meritorious performance in the British Empire, and got CBEs, and Macintyre got the Oswald medal. This sort of 1924 was a year with tremendous achievements. Yep, beauty. I might make it. Tremendous achievements in the air. You had the Douglas round the world flight of the Americans, and Brinsmead, Hector Brinsmead, who was imposing some order on the aviation scene, flew around Australia in 1924 also. The ferries did a lot of work in surveying the barrier reef from the ship HMS Geranium in the next year or so. Lovely photograph here. If you look carefully at the maps, you'll still find Goble Reef and RAAF shoals and mustard patches. Pard Mustard, anyone remember him? Yep. And Swinburne, another pilot, left their names on these places. And Williams came back from overseas. The cynic said he was cranky with Goble for getting all the limelight, so he decided he'd have a flight round the Solomon Islands. Interestingly, Macintyre, the co-pilot of Goble, was the pilot for this flight also. But a tremendous trip in the DH-50A, which they'd imported as VIP transport for the Governor-General. Macintyre, a tremendous pilot. The only person who's been there are only 4 people who have been awarded the Oscar Watt Trophy more than once. He's one of them. He left the Air Force in 1928 to become Chief Flying Instructor of the South Australian Aero Club and was killed in a crash. Interesting story there, but no time. The aeroplane that flew around Australia was actually given by the Air Force to the Australian War Museum. But the War Museum did what they did with the Vimy and said, we don't want it. It didn't take part in the war. So it was hawked around to lots of places to be stored, but in the end it just disappeared somewhere in Victoria Barracks, broken up obviously. The ferries were replaced by Supermarine Seagulls, which were far more solid because they didn't have floats. And Moresby became the survey ship, and that survived till 1924. This is the only survivor of the ferries. It's a South American, I'll do that again. It's a Portuguese aeroplane. The first person to fly across the South Atlantic was the Portuguese airman Gaio Coutinho, sort of the Kingsford Smith of Portugal. Seaplanes became very much a fashion for a while. You had HMS Albatross, you had the Emperor flying boats, and now you've got a thriving recreational flying boat scene. And tomorrow, Michael Smith will land in Point Cook on the 100th anniversary of the flight around Australia. He's an amazing character. I flew across Australia with him in his Russian seaplane. And David Jeers, who's another brilliant seaplane pilot, led another flight. Smith flew around the country clockwise, following the Goble route. Jeers decided that the winds would be better, and he's led a group of people around the country flying Sea Rays and similar little aircraft. He's about here now, and he will land at Caboolture in a week to celebrate the trip. There's some philately. If we've got any aerophilatellists here, I can bore you rotten about that for 20 minutes after the talk. This is the flight that took place in 1974 for the 50th anniversary. Freddie Flannel flying an F-111, which was the latest thing in business then. On the 21st of May, there will be an issue of stamps to cover the Goble flight. I'll finish off the story. Both Goble and Williams occupied various positions in the RAAF or in the UK between the wars. neither was accepted as the commander of the RAAF during the war. Both, and look, I'm covering stuff here that's been the material of 10 or 15 PhDs in about 30 seconds. Neither Curtin nor Menzies would really accept an Australian leading the RAAF. Both left the RAAF in 46. They probably were pushed rather than jumped. Goble died in 1948 of hypertensive cerebrovascular disease. Williams had a career in civil aviation and died in 1990. So I've called it a uniquely Australian story. A person of middle-class background, self-made, due to courage, skill, initiative, and not a little bit of luck, actually. I mean, imagine flying across... Would you fly across the Gulf of Carpentaria under those circumstances? Held back by anti-Australian prejudices, both from England and within Australia, if you can follow what I mean. You've got this idea then that Australians were second-grade people. I travelled with a lady who, in Egypt, quite extensively, who said, colonists. I mean, I don't want to... I really think he died largely as an effect of the strain and disappointment and things like that. I don't want to dwell on that, but I do hope we all recognise his amazing feat and ensure his place in Australian aviation history. Thank you. And your expert advice, audience, I'm sorry it was so superficial, but I wanted to cover a lot of ground.